right, so we're going to talk about cognitive relativism, about this article by Chris Westacott. I think we can also talk about whatever interests you guys by way of wrapping up a treatment of relativism. I do want to take a look at some of the arguments that are presented in this article in favor of relativism and talk about at least this one way of thinking about the different theses to which it's committed. Some of you who've studied Kuhn or Rorty or some others before will be familiar with this. I might link this up with some things I've done in philosophy of science before, which I guess may tie into things that you've heard me say before. Shall we simply start there with the article then? Or does anybody want to continue a theme from last time? I know we ended. Great. So on page 5 of the article, section 3, the definition of relativism, we get a number of different philosophical articulations of what could be called relativism. Remember, I distinguished last time between ethical relativism, which we're fairly familiar with in terms of discussions of right and wrong and models of behavior. Here we're talking about something that goes deeper, relativism about the very character of knowledge itself. This ends up being a feature of realism and anti-realism in philosophy of science. It faces the question specifically of whether scientific theories actually accurately describe reality or whether they simply give us a coherent set of tools for understanding reality. So, Mr. McLean, welcome. So we have Putnam's description of reason as whatever the norms of local culture believe it to be. Gellner, there is no unique truth and no unique objective reality. And then Rorty, more famously, there's nothing to be said about truth or rationality apart from descriptions of the familiar procedures of justification which any given society uses. What we have here is something like what in philosophy of science is called the theory dependence of observation. That there are no observations that stand independently of the context in which they are made and through which they are verified. Which means that the point of view, maybe a common sense, early 20th century point of view, which would hold that science is simply a matter of making observations and then looking for patterns in the observations, coming with a hypothesis that explains the observations in the best way. This is a faulty way of looking at science because the observations are not themselves completely independent of and prior to the theories that we use to explain them. Theories help to generate their own observations, and the observations are in some ways dependent upon the theoretical framework in which they are made, in which they are observed. So this is a point of view most obviously connected with Thomas Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, which I can go into in very brief form today, if you'd like. Mr. Pickle?
That's like paradigm shifts.
Paradigm shifts. So the idea behind Kuhn's theory is that science advances there are two different types of science. There's normal science, which is science governed by a stable paradigm. A paradigm is a conceptual framework with a set of background assumptions and theoretical and methodological procedures that informs a body of science, but that sometimes paradigms enter a crisis mode, and we enter then the period of revolutionary science, where we are doing science without a governing paradigm, or as part of a paradigm that's in crisis, or as part of several rival paradigms. So we see something like a punctuated equilibrium in terms of scientific progress. We will go along quite well with a static theory of the nature of the size of the universe, and then suddenly an expanding universe theory will become the new paradigm. As the classic example of this from Kuhn's history of science, of course, is the replacement of the Ptolemaic paradigm by the Copernican paradigm, then the replacement of the Newtonian paradigm by an Einsteinian relativistic paradigm. Kuhn's point is that there is no continuity between paradigms. There is no privileged extra-paradigmatic standpoint from which we can evaluate different paradigms and say that we are moving towards some kind of objective truth. Every understanding of truth is going to be bound by a paradigm. So paradigms can speak about truth internally, but you can't speak about truth across paradigms. That's a pretty strongly relativistic point of view that Kuhn takes in the first edition of the Structure of Scientific Revolutions in about 1968. Later on in the second edition, he backs off a little bit and tries to allow for some way in which we can still speak of a movement from paradigm to paradigm as representing some kind of progress. it's difficult to know how you can define progress if you can't define it as movement towards objective truth. So that's a little bit of, you said paradigm, and I thought I'd
Yeah. It seems they're all at least grounded in logical principles, mathematical principles. You know what I mean?
Right.
So
There'll be some overlap between paradigms. The most controversial relativistic claim that Kuhn makes, that he's challenged on, is that after a paradigm shift, the scientist doesn't just look at the world differently, he inhabits a different world. The world is made up of different things from the perspective of science. So we go from a universe in which there is phlogiston to a universe in which there is oxygen. And we can't say these are two alternate ways of explaining the same set of facts. The observations are themselves radically different. That, like I said, Kuhn backs off a little bit. He starts to qualify in later writings in the 70s and beyond. But that's the serious challenge. Westacott divides this up on page 6, mentions that relativism seems to have two key claims, that the truth value of any statement is relative to some particular standpoint, so there is no view from nowhere from which one can make completely decontextualized truth claims. And he indicates later on many thinkers seem to accept that. The ones who wish to avoid full-on relativism will deny the second claim, that there is no standpoint that is metaphysically privileged. So there is no way of speaking about one supreme or best standpoint. That seems to be the one that requires a full slide into relativism. So he talks about Kuhn, what I've just talked about normal science. Rorty extends Kuhn's view of science to every other sphere of culture, particularly politics. So the traditional view is to think of political progress as approaching some kind of objective realization of human rights, some greater and greater universal accordance of respect to a wider and wider circle of morally significant beings. And this is what progress represents. So the abolition of slavery is a move towards objective justice. Rorty claims that this has been a useful model of thought in the past. It no longer serves, and so what we need is something like what we've elsewhere called his democratic epistemology, or his epistemology of large-scale cultural consensus. So we can all agree that cruelty is wrong. We can all agree that United Airlines made a horrible mistake. And why? Simply because that is how we define ourselves as a community. We are the anti-cruelty community. We are people whose constitutive values are there. You can see this in maybe the political rhetoric of people who don't talk about objective justice, but talk about our values. This is not who we are, they'll say in criticizing something. Not that it's objectively wrong, though they may have pressed go there, but they'll say this doesn't express our collective consensus. And then Foucault, again, like Kuhn, doing a history, especially history of insanity and history of sexuality, in which he argues that these categories are all socially conditioned and therefore politically informed. So they are structured by the prevailing political power structures out of which they've emerged. And that means that they can be altered politically as well. We have the turn towards power that we've also talked about previously. Before I go on into arguments for relativism, maybe I'll turn it over to you guys. What shall we talk about, either in terms of understanding what relativists are claiming, or maybe looking ahead to how they argue in defense of their claims?
I think the arguments are important for us to move to, especially with regard to the second claim of the relativist.
Yeah.
It's like the first one we've heard a lot, but
Right.
The second one, I don't see as very defendable.
Okay. How would we justify the privileging of a certain standpoint? That seems to be what it amounts to. And maybe privilege is not the right way to frame it. Can we talk about a standpoint being superior to another standpoint?
Yeah, I think and I think these come up in this discussion, but like perhaps two criteria we could use are whether or not it coheres with logic and whether or not it corresponds with reality.
Okay, that latter one's going to be the trickier one, because correspondence to reality is just the thing that it's held we can't appeal to at the metaphysical level. We can use it as a common sense standard that works pretty well, like Newtonian mechanics. Right? It's accurate to within the error term that we require for normal things, but in terms of an overall theory of truth, it's inadequate, is the argument. I'm going to finish putting this up here. The first one, truth depends upon context, the context of its articulation in terms of scientific theories, or more generally. And the second, there's no privilege or for any particular standpoint, and this can be interpreted in a couple of ways. One way, of reading it is that any standpoint is as good as any other standpoint. This would be the easy and obvious way to read it. In which case, it looks like we've sort of talked ourselves into giving the Nazis, their own space to think and believe the truths that sustain their community. You mentioned two things, attacks on the second one. Connection with reality was logic.
Coherence with logic.
Okay. Would anybody like to engage one of those? Or Mr. Robinson, you want to say more about logic first?
I think I'll wait until we have more.
Sure. That's fine.
I'll just point out on page 9, this is actually what you said is basically what Richard Rorty, I think, would say, where he says that second paragraph, Rorty and Kuhn and most other relativists accept that one can have cogent reasons for preferring one standpoint to another. Preferred point of view may, for instance, exhibit greater logical consistency, which is what you said, or greater predicative power than other available perspectives. And I can just see Richard Rorty's kind of hand waving, like, of course, I'm not so stupid to say that, the Nazis are okay, but obviously there's reasons to have one standpoint over another.
Okay. So maybe we talk about not about privilege, absolute privilege, but about preference. And so what we get is a relativist who still would like to be able to at least provide a scale of preferable and less preferable, right? If not from any objective standard. I think this is the one that you're going to find difficulty getting any relativist to accept. Mr. McLean?
The problem I have with those two criteria is that the corresponds with reality. I can get anything. Because if I'm a relativist, I get to determine reality. It's not something received, it's something I place upon.
Correct.
The rawness of the world around me. But then all I have to have is so it's kind of the same as in logic is the importance of defining your terms.
Right.
Because if I define my terms in terms of reality in such a way, my logic can get you anywhere. Nazism made complete logical sense if you accept the basic terms upon which it's premised. And so the problem with that is that if we were all starting from the same point as the number 2,
Right.
then it would be number 1 would be important. But if we're all not starting in a relativist point of view,
Right.
we're not starting at this. We don't have the same starting point, so there's no requirement for a starting point.
Okay, so we start in the air, as it were. We start from where we are right now. This would be a very Rortyian point, right? We're not creating an ideal republic in our mind, and we're not trying to create the maximum, ideal distributive justice system. We're starting right here in America in 1975, maybe in Rorty's case, 1980, or in 2017, and we're asking, what do we do now? What's the social consensus now? What are the possibilities implicit in this situation? And we're very pragmatic. This is a term that Rorty claims for his own point of view, politically and, I think, epistemically. logic, you could read logic as just a purely formal criterion. You could also maybe put that in play. I can think of relativists who would say, look, if logical consistency is just one value that you might have operative at this particular place in time, and therefore in order to be taken seriously, in order to have influence and to help to shape the emerging consensus going forward, you would have to use logical argument. Though I could also say, it seems to me like I can be quite successful in shaping the ongoing social environment without a lot of logical consistency. And people don't value logic right now. Is that, Mr. Robinson, back to you, is that a problem? If I say logic just doesn't appeal to people here at this place and time, is then attacking the logical inconsistency of somebody's point of view, or say your methods of going from premise to conclusion are flawed? Does it still provide me with some kind of way of rank ordering different systems, or not?
I think logic does provide us a way of rank ordering different systems, because like we want to ask, is this system reasonable?
Right.
And, you know, it's not reasonable if it's logically invalid. So like I've heard like from personal experience, like one of our professors went to a conference that was given by Richard Rorty, and like someone called him out and they were like, "You're contradicting yourself here," and he was just like, "I don't care."
I have a good Richard Rorty story from a professor of mine from graduate school. Rorty came to visit our department, and they had dinner with some of the faculty, and one of the faculty members pressed him on this relativism of all truth, not just political or moral truth, which looks like it could bend a little bit, but something like, he said, look, if I were to hold your head under a bucket of water for 5 minutes, right, surely you'd have to admit to me that there's some way in which objective reality is impinging upon your ability to shape and define truth. And Rorty, he said, just sort of stared at the ceiling in a restaurant, right? Just sort of stared at the ceiling for a moment and said, I can get out of that. That was his only response. As a professor was years later still furious about this, the way Rorty responded kind of glibly to this. So I always think of that. That's my example sometimes of relativism in action, what I call the Rorty bucket.
Yeah, so I mean, like, I think sometimes we have to just bite the bullet on the fact that like we have the superior argument, and they don't want to think reasonably.
How do we avoid having to go through this? I would draw a diamond, but I don't have space for it. The question here implicitly in the background is, well, do we value reason? Is reason one of the ways that I decide about preferring this? Well, if this is yes, then is it reasonable is a good question to ask. But that ends up bringing me back to a circular method of argument. Kierkegaard is kind of onto this in the 1840s. He says, to one who looks at the world reasonably, reason is an acceptable criterion for organizing the world. But if you look at the world in a different fashion, Kierkegaard thinks through passionately, or through the eyes of faith, or aesthetically, then you're not going to be the rational appeal is not going to move you. And I think you're in a position when to say, well, it ought to, because you are a rational being, but we're back then to making truth claims, which are just the thing that the relativist is undermining. So so the ultimate conclusion of this section is that all arguments against relativism end up being circular. Arguments for the privilege for a certain kind of privileging can't actually find purchase in the objective world. Right? We start in the air, and you can't plant your feet to push off in an objective direction. So relativism consists just in making peace with the in-the-airness of all of our truth projects. So we try to be coherent. We try to ground ourselves in some kind of social environment or linguistic community that can give meaning to our claims, because there is nothing else. There are ways out of this, but I'm trying to think through these arguments and responses. You play rule, of course.
Yeah, I wonder, like, at what point we can dismiss a thinker like Rorty of just being a sophist, and you know what I mean? Because there's something to, like, some of the points he makes has merit, but the fact that he himself is not internally consistent with his viewpoints kind of like takes away from any sort of like system of understanding that he could come up with. And I mean, his whole the whole question of like, in order to become a philosopher, you have to inherently value the process of reason, right? Like you don't get into that field of study unless you believe that there are some inherent, irrefutable principles of logic at work in the universe with which you're pitting different ideas against.
Are we moving towards recognizing some kind of intellectual schism and just saying we may all call ourselves philosophers and hold appointments in philosophy departments, but really we're practicing something radically different? Is that I just would have to say at some point, I'm just not with those guys. Right? They're doing something else, we give it a different label, but we're not part of the same community of philosophers seeking truth. We've split. Splits are like this. You may not recognize them until long after they've actually happened. You realize them looking back at the past and the path from the past to now. You say, yeah, we had some kind of fundamental split way back in 1980, but we only realized it 40 or 50 years later. That's a possibility. I mean, that means the disruption of a kind of intellectual community.
So I don't
fragmentation.
I don't know if we want to call it like a formal schism, because I think most of like philosophical studies kind of adhere to like the same model of doing philosophy. It's just whether or not people are internally consistent, that's up to them.
Sure.
But I think like I'm more speaking of like, is there a way in which like through the study of epistemology we can just kind of like dismiss certain viewpoints that don't really have any bearing on trying to make a coherent point, but are really just seem to be just trying to throw a wrench into things other people are doing.
Okay, it sounds almost like an accusation of bad faith, which is
Right.
a pretty serious charge to make.
Which
It's been made against a lot of more radical postmodernists, is that they're just playing with language, they're not actually trying to be taken seriously.
I mean, I think if we could make an honest, assessment of Rorty, we could accuse him of bad faith.
Okay. All right, I'll put that on the table. See what